Star Wars has come a long way from an original movie trilogy to over 10 movies and 5 live-action television series at the time of publishing this video. The Star Wars universe is one of excitement and entertainment, which of course lends itself to interactive media, including video games, very well. In fact, there are well over 100 licensed Star Wars games, spanning almost every generation of gaming console and PC, not to mention the arcades. And most of them, I'm looking at you Rebel Assault 2, have been really good. In fact, I'd go as far to say that all said and told, it's probably the best film-to-game conversion a franchise has ever had. Now, I wasn't born when any of the original trilogy released, but at a fairly young age, I did watch the trilogy and I instantly fell in love with it. I've watched the original trilogy, which remains my favourite, more times than I care to admit to the internet. But while the original movies were great, they left me wanting more. I had so many questions, so many little fan-made scenarios I would make up in my head. I needed more of the story, and I got just that when I discovered Star Wars video games. Now, no matter what I search for on Google, I can't seem to find the name of this, but my first entry to the Star Wars games franchise was a 5 or 6 game variety box, which included some great games like X-Wing and TIE Fighter, which honestly deserve their own videos, but it also included a demo for Dark Forces, which to my knowledge at the time was the first Star Wars first-person shooting game. I'd played Doom before, but the idea of interacting with a Star Wars environment in a first-person perspective just blew my mind. I played that demo no less than 100 times, I'd say. I could speedrun it before speedrunning was a thing, and with a joystick no less. Yeah, remember when we played first-person shooters with joysticks, or was I the only one? Anyway, later that year I managed to get the full version of the game, and what followed was a gaming experience that I can still vividly remember over 20 years later. Now, story-wise, the game sees you play as Kyle Katarn, a former Imperial officer turned mercenary who is recruited by the Rebel Alliance to help track down a new top-secret weapons project the Empire is building. Over the course of the roughly 12 to 14 hour journey, you'll meet many new and existing characters from the Star Wars universe, including a few surprises. The story is very well told, with animated cutscenes and very solid voice acting, which was not common in 1995, especially in first-person shooters, helping to keep you engaged till its conclusion. Now, for those of you playing at home, you'll notice that while I am playing the Steam version of the game, I am running the Force Engine mod to provide native widescreen, high resolution and mouse aiming. Now, I'm generally against running mods for a playthrough. However, in this case, it doesn't really take anything away from the experience, and in my opinion, only improves it. I'll leave a link in the description for the project, and I do suggest you consider checking it out if you are interested in playing this game on a modern PC. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please do consider subscribing. It helps support the channel and you can be notified of new content the moment it drops. With that out of the way, let's grab our blaster, pop on our infrared goggles, and head back to 1995 to remember Dark Forces. Now, Dark Forces was released in 1995, which was during a time period that first-person shooters were transitioning from the labyrinth mazes of the early 90s to the fully developed interactive levels of the early 2000s, and with these changes came a lot of new mechanics that were needed to support these far more expansive levels. Take, for example, the keycard system. Now, yes, Dark Forces does feature a get the red key or blue key sections to progress, but it also includes code keys which contain a set of characters that you need to input to open high security areas in the missions, and with some of them even leading to the game's many secret areas. What makes this even more immersive is the fact that these code keys are carried by Imperial officers, which is far more immersive than having them just sitting around in a ventilation system, for example. There's also other items like snow cleats to help you traverse one of the ice levels, gas masks to help you bypass gas defenses. Honestly, for 1995, it was pretty immersive for a first-person shooter. Now, I keep saying it's an FPS, and don't get me wrong, the game is an FPS first and foremost, but there's also elements of platforming and puzzle solving, with the latter being quite challenging at times. Now, I pride myself on working things out in games, and I have not had to look up a guide for a game for many, many moons. But there's a level halfway through the game which has an elevator puzzle, which for the life of me, I could not work out how to pass, and I actually had to look up a guide for it. And if you were stumped by that same puzzle, now you have to like the video. My point is that the puzzles are good, challenging, but good. Now, I didn't ever think I'd say this in a video, but the platforming is good. Yeah, it doesn't even feel right as I say it, because I generally really dislike platforming in first-person shooters. But it's used quite sparingly here, and combined with the tight controls, feels rewarding, which is a good thing. Like any shooter, the control and movement, as well as the moment-to-moment gunplay, need to be rock solid, and it is. The best compliment I think I can give a first-person shooter is that when I die, it's my fault, and that was almost exclusively the case with Dark Forces. Difficulty is handled well, with you being able to select a difficulty per mission and the highest completion being recorded on the starting screen for each mission prior to the mission's briefing, of which you are given some backstory, some information on what you're likely to encounter, as well as your objectives prior to starting the mission. As for parts of the gameplay that don't work as well as the others, there aren't too many, but I do need to mention the clarity of some of the objectives. So each mission has you complete several objectives to pass the mission. Some of these objectives need to be completed in order to make the other objectives available, all pretty standard stuff. However, my issue is that some of the objectives, or rather some of the environments, were quite vague as to how they connected to the actual objective. Case in point, there's a level where you need to locate your equipment after having it taken from you. Now, I walked around this level for a good 10 minutes trying to find where my equipment was, until I returned to a seemingly innocuous room I'd been before, and what I thought was actually a skeleton hanging from the ceiling was my equipment. Yeah, hanging from the ceiling. Now, this is a more extreme case, to be fair, but my point remains. If you're going to issue a vague objective, you need to help the player understand how it needs to be completed. The other thing which doesn't always work is the sheer complexity of some of the levels, where you'll spend a good 5 or 10 minutes running around trying to work out how to navigate to the next area with no enemies to shoot. I've said it before and I'll say it again, when shooters stop being shooters, they often get boring. I'm here to shoot things, not go on a leisurely stroll. Now, there is a map, which does help to a degree, but I still think they could have had some further refinement in these areas. Thankfully, one of the areas that doesn't need refinement is the actual shooting, which is supported by a fair variety of weapons, some more useful than others, as well as some power-ups. First off, you have your fists, and before you discount these, there's a section in the game where Kyle defeats a Khal Dragon with his bare fists. Not even Luke Skywalker himself has done that before, but honestly, outside of this one sequence, they are fairly useless owing to very limited melee range and almost all of the game's enemies using projectile-based weapons. The first projectile-based weapon you have is the Briar Pistol, and honestly, given it uses the same ammo type as the more powerful E11 blaster rifle, also known as the Stormtrooper blaster, the times you'll use this are far and few between. Now, the weapon that you'll probably use the most in the game is the E11, which you pick up very early on in the game, and you'll find yourself pretty much using it right through until the end. It's got a good damage profile and a decent rate of fire. The accuracy is the only area it doesn't shine as bright, but it feels very well balanced because of this. A little later on, you pick up the Imperial Repeater Gun, which is a far more accurate version of the Stormtrooper blaster, but a lot less powerful per shot. Again, like a lot of the weapons in the game, they're all quite well balanced to ensure you never become overpowered, especially early on. In one of the mining levels, you'll find a mining tool which you repurpose as a weapon. Where have I heard this mechanic before? Anyway, the Geron Fusion Cutter is a fairly high damage weapon at close range, but falls off a lot at distance, which to be fair, is probably what you'd expect from a tool designed for mining. Then you have the Packard Mortar Gun, which is basically a grenade launcher complete with a fair amount of splash damage if you're anywhere near where the projectile lands when it explodes. This was quite useful in some of the larger levels with enemies on platforms above or below, but it's quite challenging to use in the more claustrophobic interior maps given the aforementioned splash damage. Then you have the Concussion Rifle, and you pick this up right around when the game starts to ramp up for its final difficulty spike. Like the Mortar Gun, there's splash damage from this, so you don't want to use it in close quarters, but the heavy damage it delivers makes it very handy against some of the game's tougher enemies, who themselves often wield concussion rifles. The last projectile weapon you acquire is the Assault Cannon, and while some of the earlier weapons do feature a secondary fire, which for the most part is not overly useful, the Assault Cannon features two completely different firing modes, complete with two completely different ammo types. You have the regular plasma energy shot, and then you have the missile launcher, which is virtually required to survive in the latter part of the game. There's also some throwables and thermal detonators, which can either detonate on impact or detonate via a short fuse, and mines. And while I appreciate the addition of the mines, I found it virtually useless, as there was never really a scenario where taking the time to plant a mine and lure an enemy over it would have been a better approach than just shooting at the enemy. Now, level design is an absolute highlight of Dark Forces. Your quest to stop the Empire will take you literally across the galaxy to many locations, from hidden rebel bases to Imperial mining facilities to the shady underworld of Nar Shaddaa. It's all here, and everything feels unique and aligned with the overall art direction of Star Wars. There's also some nice throwbacks to the movies, like a level which involves you having to break someone out from a detention facility, complete with those pesky flying droids with needles. Oh, and on the topic of droids, here's a nice touch. Throughout the campaign, you encounter several probe droids, by now a fairly recognised staple of Star Wars. Now, when you shoot these, just like in the movies, they initiate a self-destruct sequence, and if you're too close, they'll damage you when they explode. The game is full of these nice touches to continuity from the movies, and it shows that there was a lot of collaboration between the film and video game studios. The graphical fidelity is not cutting edge for the time. There were certainly games with greater graphical fidelity out on the PC in 1995. However, the overall art direction is very good for the time, and actually lends itself to being quite well realised with the high-definition Force Engine mod. As far as sound design goes, well, it's Star Wars, do I really need to say more? The sound work here is exceptional, from very faithfully recreated blaster sounds to stormtroopers yelling that you're not authorised to be here. It all feels 100% authentic, and it's a good history lesson in how movie-to-game adoptions should be handled. You also have an appropriately Star Wars soundtrack, which sounds great and includes all of the licensed tracks you would expect, as well as some of the new ones created exclusively for the game. This is definitely a game you want to play with the sound on and volume up. As I said at the start, I love Star Wars. I loved it as a child and I love it as an adult. And when I was writing this script, I asked myself, do I just love this game because I love Star Wars? And so I checked the reviews for the time, which were all quite positive, and then remembered all the sequels that followed Dark Forces: Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast. Even playing through some of the modern Star Wars games like Jedi Survivor, there are elements, I'm being careful in my choice of word here, elements of the game which call back to some of the original systems from Dark Forces. The shortcut unlocking system after complex puzzles is a system that instantly comes to mind, but there are others. Dark Forces is over 25 years old, but it still holds up not only as one of the best Star Wars games, but one of the best first-person shooters. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.